Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thank you for being here. Gad Saad is coming up on the show in just a few minutes. Excited to talk to him. He wrote a piece just the other day called Welcome to the Abyss of Infinite Lunacy. So we have some stuff to talk to him about. He's an evolutionary biologist. We obviously vehemently disagree on the evolution part, but he still has incredible insight, and he's against all this woke mob stuff. I want to specifically talk to him about the gender problem we have in America today. What is man and woman? We'll talk about it from a biological perspective. What are the differences between man and woman? That's all coming up. First, Trump yesterday. He said, we ended catch and release, shut down asylum fraud, and crippled the vicious smugglers, drug dealers, and human traffickers. That was what he did when he was president. He says, we do that no longer. Our country's being destroyed at the southern border, a terrible thing to see. And he is not wrong, not at all. And the left is starting to admit it, sort of. This is an article from the New York Times. The New York Times says the number of unaccompanied migrant children detained along the southern border has tripled in the last 2 weeks to more than 3,250. Here's the key: filling facilities akin to jails as the Biden administration struggles to find room for them in shelters. Weird. Kids in cages, right? Is that what, oh, no, it's not kids in cages. It's unaccompanied migrant children in facilities akin to jails. They're not jail, they're akin to jails. Well, what's another word for jail? Cage. Kids in cages, but it's different this time. Why is it different this time? Because Biden's doing it. You know the conservative solution to immigration? This is for all of our progressive friends. I think it's important to come right out with this right now, because I don't want progressives to look at this and think I'm just criticizing or just complaining without a solution and to respond to. Twofold. The immigration policy for a conservative is twofold. First, border security, so that no one can make it across our border into America illegally. That's the first thing. Second thing, we streamline the legal immigration process. This is essential. We streamline the legal immigration process so that kids and women and men, families, can make it to America safely. That's the key. The other day we talked to Ken Cuccinelli on the show. He was one of the heads of, he was the head of the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump. And he gave an amazing fact that no one thinks about. He said of the last 40 years, the Trump administration holds the number 1, the number 3, and the number 10 spot for most asylum seekers granted access to America, right? Confirmed or whatever, right? So you like every year for the last 40 years, how many people were granted asylum? The Trump administration, the evil, horrible Trump administration who hates immigrants, who hates foreigners, who hates Muslims, the whole thing, right? We're Nazi running concentration camps at the border, we were told. The evil President Trump was number 1, number 3, and number 10 when it came to granting asylum. Legally is the key there. Isn't that incredible? We are a generous country. We are a generous people, but it must be done legally. That's all we ask. We can't let other countries dictate our immigration policy. We are a sovereign nation. End of story. And we can't have other countries dictate our immigration policy, just like I would never expect that we can dictate the immigration policy of a different country. And no progressive would, right? No, like progressives who think that other countries can dictate our immigration policy would never think that, like, oh, I can just move to Denmark or whatever. I can just move to Guatemala and I can move there and live there and do whatever I want. No problem. We would never expect that. Yet we think other countries can dictate ours. Real quick, I should have gone into more detail about this. The number of kids, because it can't be denied by the left anymore, the number of kids. Back in January, there were on average 47 kids coming across the border every day, 47. Then the numbers went up to about 203 a day. And now we're over 300 kids a day. That's the daily average for the first week of March, was over 300 kids a day. That's a kid every 4 minutes thrown into a cage by Joe Biden. So anyway, that's the conservative solution, the conservative policy position and principle when it comes to immigration. Stop people from coming across illegally, streamline the immigration process, the legal immigration process. And that's the compassionate one. Now, the Democrats' solution to the border, which is somehow framed as the compassionate one, is to keep the system the way it is, open up the borders, and have women raped while coming across the border, children kidnapped by cartels and smuggled across the border with complete strangers, because the strangers know that they get special privileges if they come across with a kid, whether it's theirs or not. So the kids smuggled across the border with strangers, dropped on this side of the border, either thrown into a cage, first built by Obama, or re-smuggled back across the border by the cartels so they can be smuggled again multiple times. And that's compassion, we're told. We have to allow this system to go on, and not just allow it, but increase it, 6x just in the last 2 months. That's the compassionate thing to do. But they cover it up, right? They cover up that horrific system that we have today, and they don't call it kids in cages, of course. That's just when Donald Trump's president. Now they're called reception centers. I'm being for real. Here's the headline about reception centers. Isn't that nice? They're just welcome centers at the border is all. Let's talk a minute here about compassion. This is super important, this concept, that we really understand this. The left says we have to keep the borders open, and they don't say this. So they say we have to keep the borders open. The real and actual result of that is to encourage cartels to rape women and kidnap children and smuggle them across, the whole thing, right? And that's viewed as the compassionate thing. It's not compassionate. It's possible to have an excess of compassion. It's possible to have so much compassion that your feelings take over your rational brain. Here's what I mean. Aristotle, he wrote a lot about the mean, like the average of virtues. And he said, let's take a virtue like courage, for instance. He said, you can, of course, have a deficiency of this virtue. You can have a deficiency of courage, but you can also have an excess of it. You can have too much of this virtue as well. This is a very important concept, a very important thing for us to understand. And it's applicable to real life all the time. So my son's 4. So when he turned 4, we made it a big deal. And we made this poster. We have it up on his wall, and there's a tiger on it. We call him Tiger. And it says, among other things, it says, there's a time to be rough, and there's a time to be gentle. Right? There's a time to run, and there's a time to walk, and there's a time to be still. And we have all these very Ecclesiastes, like variables, right? Like there's a time to do this, and there's a time also to do this, to help them understand that there's nuance to life. Aristotle did a very similar thing. There's a virtue, but there's a proper, correct time and place for these. It's a wonderful nuance. So again, on courage, you can have a deficiency of courage. You're a coward. That's bad. But you can also have an excess of courage, and that's recklessness. That's just running into battle when it's unwise, which is also bad. So true courage is knowing when to attack and when to fall back. And Aristotle, as you can see here, has a whole list of these medians, these golden means of virtues. I bring this up because compassion is very similar to this. Compassion's a good thing, and you can surely have too little of it, right? You can have a lack of compassion. That's bad. You can be cold, right? But you can also have an excess of compassion, and we don't think of this. So because we don't think of it, people are like, oh, compassion, I have compassion, more, without thinking of the negative unintended consequences of that. You can have so much compassion, you actually end up hurting the people that you think you're helping. Let me say it again. You can have such an excess of compassion Just like you can have an excess of courage. I know it sounds so weird. You're like, no, courage is good. Yeah, of course it is. But you could have an excess of it. That's what Aristotle said. And I'm saying the same thing. You can have compassion's good. You can have an excess of it. You can have too much compassion where it ends up hurting the very people that you think you're helping. In life, it's great to have compassion. It's great to have compassion for infants and really old people and people who can't take care of themselves. But it's not good to apply that principle to everybody all the time. Because if you have people who have an excess of compassion, right? They'll look at anything that has an inequitable distribution. So like an example that's today is, well, a local district here in San Diego, they just got rid of their advanced classes because there were too many white and Asian kids in it. There weren't enough black and Hispanic kids, right? So that's inequitable. So their compassion forces them to look at this inequity and assume that black and brown kids are the victims and therefore should be treated like infants. And then the flip, everyone else who's on the top, if you will, is a vicious predator as well, right? It's good to treat infants like infants. It's not good to treat 12-year-olds like infants, or 25-year-olds, or 50-year-olds like infants, or black people like infants, or Hispanic people like infants. Your excess of compassion is treating people like they're babies and can't take care of themselves. You can be too compassionate with your kids, right? If you're too compassionate for your kids, you end up doing everything for them. You end up doing everything for them, and then your kids grow up to be useless, and they hate you for it. And they hate everyone else and everything else around them. They're bitter because they can't do anything for themselves. They're incapable to function in life. And you've paralyzed them, you've crippled them because of your excess of compassion. I'll never forget it. I think it was a Harvard professor who studies this, right? She studies this, she researches this. She's on my side with this, like she's agreeing, I'm sure, with the sentiment that I'm speaking of. She wants kids to grow up to be, self-sufficient and all this stuff, right? So she researches this and studies this and writes books about this. And she herself noticed one day at dinner, she was reaching across the table and cutting the steak of her 12-year-old son. Cutting his steak into little pieces like he's a little baby bird. Jordan Peterson made the point that in nursing homes, they have a very harsh rule that you should never do something for someone that they can do themselves. Even if there's an old person at a nursing home who's struggling to feed themselves, you have to let them struggle. You have to watch them struggle and not intervene. Same with children. We've been having generations of parenting, of treating kids like little babies. Don't climb that. Don't leave my side. Be careful. Don't get hurt. Don't get dirty. Don't forget your helmet and your knee pads and your wrist guards and this protective bubble that you have to walk in every time you leave the house. Treating kids like helpless infants. And gosh, wouldn't you know it, now they're adult helpless victims. They started out as little babies, and now they're still babies, just bigger. Helpless victims who whine and complain about everything, about every little thing in life. Watch your compassion. Use it judiciously. It's a wonderful virtue, compassion. And some people don't have enough of it and they need more. But you can use it too much. And you can use it in inappropriate places, in inappropriate ways that actually end up hurting the very people that you think you're helping. And it's true at the border. And this is the true story. When you open borders, you encourage cartels to rape women and kidnap children, and many of whom die along the way. Is that compassionate? No. To allow that is an excess of compassion. So I call for true compassion. We need to do what it takes to stop the cartels and stop the coyotes from having so much power, and we need to streamline the legal immigration process. This is for our country's own good and for immigrants' own good as well. True story. Mike Slater. Gad Saad again, coming up. Spread the word. Slater Crusaders, how do we get out of this mess that we're in? Coming up on Friday, our special is about cancel culture. And we're just gonna run through all the cancel culture stories. And we're also gonna talk about how to get out of it too. And we're gonna talk to someone who was canceled as well. But it's just insane. Every single day, there's another one. One of the band members of Mumford & Sons left the band and apologized because he sent a tweet out saying, Andy No, who writes against Antifa, he read the book and was like, hey, you were brave for writing it, great book. And he had to leave the band. His bandmates kicked him out. Every day there's another story. How do we get out of it? Courage. Moral courage. I'll never forget when I talked to Jordan Peterson a couple years ago, I said, what characteristic do we need more of in this country and in ourselves? And he said, courage. I know we talked a little bit about courage a second ago, so let's dive a little deeper into this and talk specifically about moral courage. And this is also my intro to Gad Saad because I know he agrees with this. He is a man of moral courage. First, when we think courage, I think first we think physical courage, right? And we're way off on that too. We are physically weak. We lack physical courage and physical skill. Men, and we're gonna talk about gender differences coming up with Gad as well. Men build, provide, create, protect, instruct. These are good things for society, but in America today, those things are called toxic. And boys are medically treated. We medically and therapeutically remove masculinity from their souls instead of channeling it properly because we don't know how to define masculinity properly. We tell kids not to climb trees, don't play with toy guns, don't leave my sight. Every single time I go to the playground with my kids, every time, I'm not kidding, every time there's a parent who says to his kid, oh, be careful. Be careful. They're 3 feet off the ground. And the ground's a padded rubber mat. There's zero chance anyone could possibly get hurt. But this poor kid is just constantly barraged in their soul with, be careful, don't take risks, stay safe. Sperm count's down, testosterone levels are down, grip strength is down, winning is bad, everybody gets a medal. We're all being domesticated. We did a segment a couple months ago about how recruits at military boot camp, the recruits keep breaking their bones. They keep breaking bones. They can't pick up the rucksack and run with it. It breaks their brittle little bird bones. Because these kids, these new recruits, they've just been playing video games their whole life. And they have weak balsa wood bones, little brittle twig bones. They can't even make it through boot camp. They can't pick up heavy things because it breaks their bones. Like, we are a nation of weaklings and cowards. There's a great Spartan story. So the swords that the Spartans used were very short. They were like this long. Right? You know, a normal sword would be like this long, but they were like knives almost. Short swords. And a little Spartan boy didn't understand why the sword was so short. And his mother said, add a step to it. Add a step to it. Meaning the long swords, right? You can stand back from your enemy and like fight like this, right? But with a Spartan sword, you got to step towards the enemy, right? And when you take a step, when you add a step to it, that sword's now the perfect length. Takes courage to add a step to it. It's also why the Spartans weren't archers. That was a cowardly thing to do, to shoot from afar. We are cowardly, physically and morally. People afraid to stand up for the truth, getting bossed around by the anti-racists, and you have to put your foot down and say enough is enough. Wall Street Journal, someone wrote an editorial about their experience at a private school in New York City. Now, you're saying, well, I don't go to a private school in New York City. No, your kid's school, same thing, right? It's every school, every public school, and many private schools as well. And it's the same thing we've talked about many times, teaching little kids to see race, teaching them how to be an ally, reading White Fragility, starting school-sponsored affinity groups to form bonds with people of their skin color. Like, this is messed up stuff. This is what Klansmen would do. Right? Like if a Klansman, if a member of the KKK, if the Grand Wizard or whatever they're called, of the KKK ran your public school, like he was the superintendent, he would come in and say, hey everyone, we should start groups for students based on skin color. We should have groups and we should separate kids based on, because we don't want the races, like talking and like communicating and like touching each other, right? So we really want to separate, like that's Klansman stuff. But it's woke today. Stuff we know is wrong, completely contrary to Martin Luther King Jr.'s judging people by the content of their character, right? Instead, we are purely judging people by the color of their skin, and it's being implemented in your kid's school. It's insane. It has to stop, but no one will stand up to it. Let me share a little bit of this guy's story. And then the kicker, the reason why I'm sharing it. So he is half Mexican, half Jewish. And he grew up and he's like, yeah, I knew I had darker skin than my classmates, but I was never taught, that's the key, taught to define my identity by the color of my skin. My mixed background and ancestry made me feel like nothing more than a typical American. That's how we should be teaching our kids that, oh, you're just a typical American. No, you're this, you're that. Don't put, you're in that group, you're in that group. His wife, this author's wife, came to America as a refugee from the Soviet Union. These people see what's going on. It reminds me of Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, right? More than anyone, the people who have come from communist countries, they're the ones who are here in America saying, does anyone see what's happening here? I've seen this before, where the communist country I came from, I've seen this happen. It doesn't end well. And we're not paying attention. She had Jew stamped on her passport. She was told in her school that she needed to keep tabs on friends and family. And she even once turned in her own father to the police for crimes against the state. That's how they turned kids against their parents. And we see the same thing happening today. He says, suffice it to say, we are both allergic to forced conformity, especially when young, impressionable children are trained to obsess over racial differences and to be on the lookout for deviations from orthodoxy. Every school and business has these anti-racist seminars and training. Every public school and most private schools too. You know, I've been pretty hard on the public schools lately. Not hard enough, quite frankly. Private schools are just as bad, sometimes much worse. Where there's no such thing as a shared humanity. Everyone is your racial group and that's it. You must place your race at the heart of your identity. It's all grievance, no gratitude. And your kids are trained to be anti-racist activists. So why do I bring this up? Why do I bring this up? To introduce Gad Saad. Here's this line from the Wall Street Journal. Masquerading as anti-racism, this cynical worldview is being spread like a virus by an army of paid consultants and true believers. Few people have been willing to stand up against it. At Riverdale, his school, many parents privately express concerns but aren't willing to speak up. They fear being called racist or worse, losing their coveted spots. True story? Story that no one wants to hear. People are scared to stand up for the truth. The biblical and American truth regarding race, which is we're all human and we should judge each other based on the character and actions of individuals. But we don't do that. No one stands up and says that anymore because we're physical weaklings and we're moral cowards. Not a good combination for the future of a country. We're scared to be called racists. And because of that, the real racists are winning. Gad Saad, up next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Gad Saad. You have to read his newest book. It's called The Parasitic Mind. Go buy it right now and go to his website and listen to his podcast and videos and the whole thing. He's a professor and evolutionary behavioral scientist. Mr. Saad, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. Great to be with you again.
Great to talk to you. You gave this talk on your podcast, Welcome to the Abyss of Infinite Lunacy. It's every day we're inundated. Where is it coming from, and what is the most lunatical thing, most lunatic thing you've seen so far?
Well, it's a tough competition to find a winner, and that's why I listed 21, but I could have gone for 2,100 ones. Look, it all comes from a set of idea pathogens that were spawned on university campuses. That's the whole point of my book, The Parasitic Mind. So parasitic ideas include postmodernism, militant feminism, social constructivism, identity politics. biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain human behavior. So all of these, when they're put together, create a complete departure from reason, and hence the abyss of infinite lunacy.
One thing you talk about is how these ideas have a kernel of truth to them,
Yeah.
and they always have a noble goal at the end. So that's important to realize, but what do we do with that, and why do they take it so far?
Well, because as I say, you're exactly right. They start with a kernel of truth, and then in the desire to instantiate some noble cause, let's say we want to create equality across the sexes. So equity feminism is something that you and I would certainly agree to. Equity feminism basically says there should be no institutionalized, barriers to an equal playing field for men and women. They should be equal under the law. The problem then comes when that metamorphosizes into militant feminism, which in the service of that original noble goal then argues that there are no such things as evolved sex differences. Men and women are indistinguishable from each other. All differences between men and women are largely due to social construction. So in the pursuit of a laudable goal, you end up murdering truth. And I argue that we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I could be a strong supporter of, a just world without ever ceding an inch of truth in the pursuit of that goal.
Ah, so good. Okay, can we talk about gender differences? Because I think this is one of the most important things today is that we identify what the gender differences are, and obviously you can provide the insight into where they came from. And I would argue we need to really lean into and accentuate those gender differences because we complement each other in beautiful ways that are being, as you said, destroyed. So let's identify these. What are the differences between male and female?
So let's take it back to the root of the theoretical framework that explains sex differences. So Charles Darwin argued that there are two mechanisms by which a species evolves. There's natural selection. These are traits that a species will evolve to have because it confers a survival advantage. So for example, in the human context, the fact that you and I have evolved gustatory preferences for fatty foods makes perfect sense because our ancestors evolved in an environment of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty. And that's why you and I prefer to eat, a fatty, juicy steak than say raw celery. So that would be an example of natural selection. Sexual selection is the mechanism that explains how a trait evolves, not because it confers a survival advantage, but a reproductive advantage. So for example, the peacock's tail could not have evolved to be of that size and that conspicuous nature because it actually reduces the survivability of the peacock. It makes it harder for him to avoid predators, right? Therefore, that tail must have evolved through a dual process called sexual selection, namely through recurring female mate choice. Females prefer the male with the large appendage because it signals his honest phenotypic quality. It says, look, the fact that I have this big tail and I'm still here and I haven't been eaten means that I am the top genetic dog, choose me. This is called the handicapping mechanism. Well, take this principle and apply it to all sexually reproducing species, right? So in many species, the males and females look exactly alike. In other words, they don't have any sexual dimorphism. In the human context, we are a sexually dimorphic species. For example, men are on average bigger than women, taller than women. There are some things that we are exactly the same on, and some things that men and women are very much different on. And the only way to explain that is through the lens of evolutionary theory. So there's nothing racist or Nazi-like or bigoted in arguing that men and women are on some things similar and on some things different. It's the basis of evolutionary theory.
What is brilliant and beautiful, obviously. What are some things give me some examples of things that men or women are different on that the feminists hate?
Right. So the classic example or the rubric where the feminists might be most triggered would be when it comes to the mating domain, right? There are some elements of sex-specific mating preferences that are very different across the sexes, right? So, for example, if you ask around the world at grossly different cultures, so you can't say it's due to the West or it's due to Oprah or it's due to Cosmopolitan. You could go to the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon who've never seen Oprah, and you'll end up with the same mating preferences. One thing we find, for example, that men place much greater importance on physical beauty of their prospective mates than women do. Now, that doesn't mean that women don't care about gorgeous men, but they care less about it. On the other hand, when it comes to ascending the social hierarchy, women care a lot more about that in their prospective mates. No man has ever uttered the following words: I will not have sex with you because you are simply not exhibiting a lot of ambition at work. Many women have uttered those words.
Wow. Okay, what's the evolutionary reason for that difference?
Right. So that's a great question, because it gets at the root of how evolutionists think, which is what we like to do is say, are there any specific challenges that men and women would have faced in their ancestral environment that would cause them to exhibit sex differences in mating? Well, when it comes to, say, variety seeking and mate choice, well, both sexes enjoy variety, but there's a much greater premium on seeking variety for men than there is for women. Now, this doesn't mean that you are condoning this. So oftentimes people wrongly think that when an evolutionist offers a scientific explanation for child abuse or for domestic violence or for marital infidelity, somehow they are condoning it. They are justifying it. That's a completely imbecilic position to take, because that's like arguing that if an oncologist studies cancer, he is for cancer, he is justifying cancer, he is supporting cancer. No, you're simply trying to explain it. So to the extent that infidelity happens, to the extent that there is tension in a monogamous union, an evolutionist will come along and say, okay, what are some evolutionary reasons that cause people to ever want to stray? Now, when it comes to the original question of why would men prefer women who are more beautiful and why would women prefer men who are higher status, it's because they face unique challenges. A woman ultimately has to have a man who is going to be vested in her. We are a biparental species, right? We are one of the few mammalian species where males actually invest heavily in their children. Therefore, nature has made it such that we have to pair bond for a long time. Well, if you have to pair bond for a long time, then you better make sure that the guy that you're with is not a complete dud. He can fight for resources. He can protect resources. There's nothing sexist about that. As a matter of fact, you can go to the most powerful women on earth, billionaires, diplomats, neurosurgeons, and you ask them, what kind of men do you want? Guess what? They will even insist more on a man of very high status. In other words, the reason that women seek men of high status, it's not because historically they've been oppressed. It's because this is a terribly attractive trait in the mating market, and it has been the case since time immemorial.
So good. Okay, so I'm thinking of the feminists who said, you know, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. So they would explain, how would a feminist or a postmodernist explain that it's culture? Or is that what they would do? Would they say, oh no, these aren't biological, these are cultural differences because men want to oppress women and, right? So or what would they say?
Yeah.
So what would they say are the cultural reasons? And then they want to get rid of those cultural reasons? Is that how this works?
Right. So that speaks to another idea pathogen that I mentioned at the start of our segment, where I refer to social constructivism, right? Social constructivism is the idea that we are born with empty minds, tabula rasa in Latin, right? And it's only socialization that makes us who we end up becoming. So why do men prefer to mate with women who look like Beyonce more than with their lawnmowers? Oh, it's because they learned that through Elle magazine. Why do women want guys who are risk takers, who wrestle alligators on their six packs and are tall and are neurosurgeons? Oh, that's because they saw it in Hollywood images. Well, that's a profoundly imbecilic argument, because socialization is not contra biology, right? Yes, socialization happens. Nobody is contesting the fact that people are socialized, but socialization happens in its form because of biology, not contra biology, right? There is no religion that, for example, says, irrespective of which religion you come from, there is no religion that says, hey, ladies, go out and have unencumbered sex, whereas men should be chaste and virginal. That's not by coincidence. That's because there is a premium on why women should be more choosy in their mate choice, right? There's nothing sexist about that. When it comes to parental investment, women incur much greater minimal obligatory parental investment than men. In other words, to put it in simpler words, if a woman makes a wrong mate choice, the costs to her are much greater than it is for men. Therefore, she has to be more judicious in her mate choice. Therefore, when parents socialize their daughters to be more sexually restrained, when your priest tells women more than men, it's not because it's part of the patriarchy. It's because there are biological reasons to explain why cultural phenomena occur in the form that they do.
Oh, Gad. Oh, I love talking to you.
I'm blowing your mind, aren't I?
I love it. It's so good. Okay, so why would someone be biophobic, and why in today's culture is this so appealing to so many people?
Oh my God, you're asking such lovely questions. People are biophobic because they think that by explaining something through biology, it becomes a form of biological fatalism, right? It basically says, oh, it's my genes who made me cheat on you. So how could I have controlled myself? Oh, it's the genes that made me eat the juicy burgers. But that's a completely idiotic position because it's all an interaction. Our genes are constantly interacting with our environments. As a matter of fact, genes are either turned on or off as a function of environmental inputs, right? So there is something liberating, wrongly liberating, about thinking that we're all born with empty slates, right? Your child, Mike, could be the next Michael Jordan, as long as you hug him right, or don't hug him enough, or give him enough Big Macs, or don't give him enough Big Macs. There is nothing inherent about Michael Jordan that was likely to cause him to be, more likely to become the great NBA player. Well, that's a very hopeful message. It's a completely nonsensical BS message, but it frees me of the shackles of biology. So I think most people have that reflex because they think that it's more kumbaya and more utopian, right? It's the land of unicornia. We could all hold hands and be all Einsteins or Michael Jordan or Lionel Messi. No, we can't. We are shackled by our biological realities, whether you like it or not. So that's the reason why people are so biophobic.
I have 100 more questions, and we got about 2 minutes. So let's go to Derrida. So
Yeah.
I hear you talk about Derrida and how language creates reality. I feel like this is really important that I understand this. So who is Derrida, and what does that expression mean?
So Derrida was part of a movement of postmodernists. They come in slightly different ilks, but they all share a commitment to BS with faux profundity. So Jacques Derrida was basically someone who argued that, you're constrained by how you label things, right? So I tell a story in The Parasitic Mind about me having a discussion with a postmodernist where she wouldn't concede that only women bear children, and she wouldn't concede that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, because she argued that, what do you mean by east? What do you mean by west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. To which I answered, well, okay, the dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. And then she said, well, I don't play those label games. Well, what she was doing there is she was aping Derrida, who basically said, we are completely constrained by the manner by which we label things. Language creates reality. No, language certainly labels reality, but reality exists whether I can name something or not. And so this is why I think all that postmodernist nonsense is a form of intellectual terrorism.
So someone who believes that, what do they say? Like, so man doesn't exist because I've labeled it as man. So if we call it something different, then it won't exist anymore. Is that the thought?
Well, the idea is that you don't want to be constrained by something as pesky as an objective truth, right? So it's liberating in that everything is subjective, everything is relativist, right? You are bound by your personal biases as a scientist, and this refers to something you mentioned earlier when we talked about. It starts off with a kernel of truth. There is a kernel of truth to the fact that yes, there is subjectivity in some of the things that we do, but to argue that there are no universal truths is insane, because then what do scientists wake up every day hoping to discover?
Yeah, and the extreme of that is 2 + 2 doesn't necessarily equal 4. I mean, it's to that
exactly.
extreme base. Gad Saad, I wish we could talk for hours. You're a busy man. We got to run. I hope we can do it again. Everyone, please go buy the book right now, The Parasitic Mind, and follow Gad Saad on everything. Dr. Saad, wonderful to talk to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.
I hope we can do it again. True story.
Anytime.
Mike Slater. Spread the word.
sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
As Slater said, courage has been the theme of the show today. And it takes courage for someone to stand up against Maxine Waters, who's been the congressman for far too long. Joe Collins is that man. He's a Navy vet, so he's got that courage in him. Joe Collins for Congress.com wants to represent South LA. What's going on, Joe?
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Hey, man, why does Maxine Waters keep winning time after time again? How can this possibly be?
I think it's because she's been there for a long time, one. And then two, there has never been anyone to be able to run against Maxine who could speak the language of the people who live in that district. I mean, it's a D+54 district, heavily Democrat. And then you have Republicans that come into the district and try to preach a Republican message that, you know, no one has ever heard before and no one really agrees with. So I think that when you get someone who wants to run for that office, for that particular seat, you have to be able to speak the language of the people and address the issues that are important to the people who live in the district.
I need an example, obviously, but it's so interesting. Do you think you're talking more to Maxine Waters voters or people who have never voted before and just aren't that engaged?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, you have people who are familiar with Maxine Waters and they don't know anything other than Maxine Waters, and so we have to engage with those voters. And people who don't get involved because they feel disenfranchised, they're more important to engage on a regular basis.
Okay, so give me an example. Speaking the language. What does that mean?
Speaking of language, addressing issues that are important to people who live in the community. Like a lot of people would say that police killing black people is a huge issue. Conservatives would say that black people killing black people is a huge issue. Now, I think, in my opinion, that both is an issue. And so those are the issues that we have to address. Conservatives would say, you know, go work hard, get an education. People who live in a district will tell you that we have no quality jobs or quality education in our community. And so those things are a problem. So instead of telling people what to do, we have to figure out the way to address the shortcomings of the district that was created by people who have been in office for a very long time, like Maxine Waters.
Is that a message? I love all that. Is that a message that, hey, this district's been run by Democrats for 80 years and look at it? Like, does that resonate at all or what?
It just depends on who says it. I mean, we can say it, but then, you know, you have to come back. What are you going to do in order to fix the district? Like, how we're going to create jobs? How can we create a better school system? How can we get people actively involved in the local politics?
What can government do versus what people can do? And how do you talk about that when you're knocking on doors?
Well, government can't do much. I think it's the government responsibility to ensure that people maintain their freedoms, their unalienable rights that was given to them by God and protected by the Constitution. What people can do is they can stand up and push back against politicians who have failed our communities for a very long time. That's the biggest power right there.
What's the black church? How do you speak to the Christians? Black Christians, do you speak differently to them? Do they have a different language? Is that a different culture? What do you do with that?
I think for black Christians, the biggest thing is that they're mainly Democrat with conservative values. And so instead of preaching Republican, I think that we talk about the issues in the community, like why is gun violence high? What do we have to do in order to get these, young men off the streets? What do we have to do in order to create better influences for young men to follow outside of, gang culture, rap culture, and sports? And what can we do to bring better jobs into our community? I think these are points that people want to hear. And now if a Republican talks about these things and is able to bring these things into fruition within a district, I think that you'll see more people leaning towards the Republican Party just based on the fact that we're creating schools, we're creating better jobs, we're creating better lifestyles.
Is there any policy that like the National Republican Party has that just does not work in South LA and that you disagree with or like is unelectable and like you're against the National Republican Party on? Or no, are these universal principles and policies?
I think that, what we have to talk about is the engagement into Black and Latino communities from the Republican Party. I think that's one thing that I do not agree with. They do not engage in a Republican and Democrat districts and Black and Latino districts. I think that's something that we have to change. It started happening a long time ago, and it's a failing concept that's been pushed down from generation to generation. Don't engage the Black community because it's hard. But now you have Black people who want to be Republican, who have conservative values, who want to be a part of the party. And it's like, what is our avenue? So I think that will be the one thing that I say I don't agree with, and that's the lack of engagement in our communities.
Yeah, and I would say the policy and principles, I think, are universal for everyone in this country, I would argue. Joe Collins for Congress.com. We got to support people like Joe who are out there on the ground. Joe, appreciate you, man.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Running against Maxine Waters. Joe Collins for Congress.com. It takes courage to do stuff like that. And that was the theme of the show today. Courage. Physical courage and moral courage. We need much more of it. True story. Mike Slater. See you tomorrow. Spread the word.